Good evening. Welcome to this year's cover workshop. This is an annual workshop held in honor of the late Professor Robert Cover's commitment to the intersection of scholarship and legal activism. We're holding the workshop this year at 6 p.m. 6th of January. I look forward to learning from our speakers and hopefully finding some courage. My name is Catherine Grosso. I teach law at Michigan State University. I'm also the co-president of the Society of American Law Teachers with Beto Juarez, who's the dean of the Shepherd Broad College of Law at Nova Southeastern University. SALT is a community of progressive law teachers, administrators, librarians, academic support experts, and affiliates who are committed to advancing teaching excellence, social justice, and diversity. We are delighted to co-sponsor this timely workshop with the American Constitution Society again this year. Before passing the mic to Senator Feingold, I want to invite all of you to join us at our annual celebration and awards ceremony tomorrow night. We're celebrating great teachers and leaders in work to confront racism and to advance the rights of immigrant youth this year. Information about how to join the celebration or to join SALT is on our website, and I will put those links in the chat. Thank you, and now for Senator Feingold.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you so much to SALT for your partnership, not only on this program, but in advancing a progressive vision of the law and the legal community. Good evening. My name is Russ Feingold, and I am president of the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal organization, with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS just finished celebrating its 20th year of shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. There you can join ACS and find more information about various upcoming events and opportunities, including videos of our previous programs. Now, I am honored to welcome you to tonight's program, Safeguarding Democracy, Lessons Learned from January 6th. Tonight's program is a bit personal for me. For 18 years, I had the privilege of working in the U.S. Capitol. I had the honor of walking its halls and working with dedicated public servants and law enforcement officers who serve their country every day, trying to do their best to protect and preserve our democracy. Our Capitol's image, however, as a temple of liberty and a city on a hill was forever tarnished when 1 year ago today, an angry insurrectionist mob stormed the building and sought to overturn Donald Trump's defeat by disrupting Congress's certification of the 2020 presidential election. It was a dark day for democracy, a terrifying day for lawmakers and staff who were locked down and evacuated as rioters assaulted the Capitol building's heroic and overwhelmed law enforcement officers. There's obviously a lot that can be said about what led to January 6th and how it could have been prevented. But instead of mostly looking back, today's discussion is an opportunity to look forward and ask what steps we can take now to prevent a future January 6th attack. And what should we learn from other countries that have lived through attacks on their own democracies? We do have an incredible panel of experts with us today. To get this conversation started, I will soon turn this over to today's moderator, Rachel Kleinfeld. Rachel is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on issues of the rule of law, security, and governance in post-conflict countries, in fragile states, and in states in transition. Her work bridges comparative and U.S. democracies through her services on the National Task Force on Election Crises and as the former CEO of the Truman National Security Project. Named one of the top 40 under 40 political leaders in America by Time magazine in 2010, Rachel has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and other national television, radio, and print media. So it's hard to think of someone better to lead today's conversation. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Senator Feingold. It's a huge honor to be here with all of you and with our speakers today on such a sad but historic day for the country. In any other country, we know what to call it when an armed mob attacks the legislature as they're determining the next president in a contentious election. It's really easy in America to become complacent that we're the world's oldest democracy, but for a comparative democracy scholar, America really only consolidated our democracy in 1965. And prior to that, comparative democracy scholars rate American democracy at really middling levels. We think of our democracy as consolidating in 1965 and becoming inclusive. And prior to that, we really look much more like the newly independent and decolonizing states. And if you think of us that way, we've really only been trying to become a multicultural, inclusive society and democracy for a little over 50 years. That's not very long. Democracies globally have been degrading for the last 15 years. And the United States was on one of the fastest downward trajectories, according to Freedom House. I'm on that board. We just moved India, the world's largest democracy, to partially free. And America now ranks alongside Armenia, Romania, and Croatia. So we're not doing great. The Economist, their intelligence unit, has also degraded the US to a flawed democracy just a few years ago, keeps dropping. Pippa Norris's Electoral Integrity Project rates our elections as lacking in trust in roundabout Panama or even Mexico. And the Center for Systemic Peace, whose scores are used to create the CIA's political task force ratings, they just degraded the US to an anocracy. That's a term of art, but basically when countries fall into the anocracy category, they're below democracies. They actually fall into the highest risk of political instability or adverse regime change. Importantly, these organizations aren't the same. They're giving different reasons for the US to have its democracy downgraded. It's not one big thing. In other words, it's many, many small things. Some single out gerrymandering, others loss of trust or vilification of the opposition. And all of these things coming together are starting to raise really significant alarm bells. The goal of this panel is not just to raise alarm bells, it's to share lessons of what is to be done and what can be done. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Professor Harold Koh, I really don't need to introduce, I think, any more than I would have needed to introduce Senator Feingold. Professor Koh is the Sterling Professor of International Law, the highest honor that Yale Law can give. He served as the Dean of the Law School from 2004 to 2009, after which he went to the State Department to serve as legal advisor, and previously was Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He holds 17 honorary degrees, 30 awards for human rights work. He was doing human rights work when I was a babe in arms, I believe. Dean Hariasovsky is the Dean at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and also the Dean and Mira James Bradwell Professor of Law there. Her more than 50 publications really focus on improving governance and addressing injustice, particularly in energy and climate change regulation. And she's deeply committed to interdisciplinary, collaborative, international partnerships to bring about positive change, and has led just a multitude of American and international bodies committed to those goals. Donald Sherman is Vice President and Chief Counsel at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, which I'll call CREW to avoid the mouthful. As well as practicing law, Donald served in the House, the Senate, the White House, and the judicial branches. So that's a trifecta for those of us in Washington. His multiple roles in the House include serving as the ranking member of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. In the Senate, he was senior counsel to Claire McCaskill and chief oversight counsel to the late Representative Elijah Cummings. He was special assistant to the president for racial and economic justice at the White House. He's been chief of staff and senior counsel for oversight and investigations at HUD. He was counsel for the House Ethics Committee. Basically, the guilty should quake in their shoes if Donald Sherman comes after them, and that is what he does at CREW. So we're going to start off discussing the problem, what is going wrong in the country, and then we're going to look at what can be put right. How do we strengthen the pillars of accountability? We're then going to look a little bit at backlash. What are the ways our good intentions could be creating some of the problems? And then we'll take Q&A. And I encourage you, don't wait till the end to send us your Q&A. Please type them in. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout. Keep them coming, and we will answer them at the end, but I'll be trying to aggregate throughout the whole talk. So let's start with some context setting. So we all start with a shared understanding, and I'll start with you, Professor Koh. Can you lay out for all of us, why was January 6th such a serious assault on our constitutional democracy?
Well, thank you, Rachel. You know, when you're in elementary school, you're taught that we, the people in the United States, rule by the rule of law and not by the rule of force. And when you think about it, that rests on three unspoken assumptions. First, elections matter. Elections determine who govern us. Every person's vote counts. And even if you didn't vote for a government, you accept it if it won fair and square. Second assumption is that losers leave peacefully. And third, there's such a thing as the truth, which allows us to determine whether who was fairly elected and what we should do. One of the reasons this was such a shocking moment a year ago today is that all of these assumptions were called into question at the same time. You know, first, a loser didn't leave peacefully. A defeated president refused to concede. He refused to leave office. Initially, he spent weeks trying without evidence to delegitimize a fair election by making false claims of voter fraud, whipping up his base to challenge the vote certification and claiming it was a constitutional coup that had happened against him. This was really rare. Even the Confederates had recognized Lincoln's election. That's why they seceded rather than trying to claim that they were president. But then he didn't leave peacefully. As the constitutional process to certify his successor was occurring, he called on a mob to go to the Capitol and disrupt it in the most sustained attack on the US Capitol since the War of 1812. With his imprimatur, and while he was silently watching, this violent mob brutally invaded the civic space where all three of his constitutional successors were gathered and threatened their lives, and also those of every member of the legislative branch. They disrupted the constitutional process and they killed a number of innocent people in an effort to overturn a peaceful election result. Over time, it became clear that this was not accidental, that the former defeated president actually strategized about this, that they had harnessed populist rage, a toxic blend of white supremacist organizing, social media, armed violent protests, which had run through a series of events in the previous couple of years. The Tree of Life synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, Charlottesville, the armed attack on the Michigan Capitol, the threats to kidnap the sitting governor, the appearance of armed groups at Black Lives Matter rallies, protests against lawful COVID restrictions, which all led up to the predictable attack at the Capitol last year. And then when this was all brought out, 1 year later, today, millions are saying it was actually like a tourist visit of the Capitol. The rioters were actually protecting democracy, which is a common truth. So why is it such a big deal? The toxic formula is there. It almost succeeded. Little has changed. It could all happen again. The only question being where and when the next flashpoint will be. And perhaps most troubling, instead of coming together to agree on shared principles and to restore our common faith, we've only been split further apart. Instead of uniting to prevent recurrence, things have gotten more polarized, which is why we need to use occasions like this to strengthen our shared commitments to these very basic assumptions: moderating violent extremism, fair elections, the rule of law, and the truth.
Thank you. I think if you were laying out the case, you've done a good job. And of course, the situation has even gotten worse since the beginning of Trump's tenure. You had about 4,000 threats against members of Congress. Now we have about 9,600, and all of these things are ratcheting up. I'd like to go through, starting with you, Dina Sofsky, and then Donald Sherman, and then back to you, Professor Coe, what you see as the greatest threat to our democracy now, and then what the most important thing you or your institution can do to strengthen democracy based on your particular role in our system. So Dina Sofsky, if I can turn to you first.
So it's such an honor to be included in this important conversation 1 year after the assault on our Capitol, and to follow the insightful comments of my teacher and longtime mentor, Professor Harold Coe. I think he did a good job of capturing a lot of what threatened our democracy. And so I just want to briefly highlight, I think, a few sort of bigger picture issues. I mean, one is that to me, the biggest threat is actually inequity, racism, and discrimination, the barriers we erect to voting, which have already been referenced. And it's important, I think, to acknowledge the symbols of white supremacy that were displayed during the January 6th attack. A deep polarization in our society in which people rely on sources of information from those they trust, a lack of understanding of our democratic process, lawyers who do not uphold their professional obligations to advance claims supported by facts and evidence, though I think it's important to acknowledge the many lawyers and judges from across the political spectrum who did uphold their professional obligations. And even with the concerns people have about our democracy here and the downgrading just talked about around the world, and I know we'll get to that more later, there are too many places where authoritarianism, violence really prevent democratic process in foundational ways. I'm speaking, of course, from the perspective of a law school dean, and I think there are so many things that law schools can do. And in keeping in the short answers we've agreed to, I'll highlight 3 for now. One is that I think law schools can support voting and provide resources for voters. This was something that when I was dean at Penn State Law in the middle of the election, and obviously Pennsylvania was a particular flashpoint in this election, that there was a point about a week or two before the election where people got really scared. And our law school was able to play a role in really helping convene resources and forums for people who were feeling concerned, including around voter intimidation. I also think that law schools can play a really important role in teaching about democratic process, rule of law, equity, professional responsibility, not just in our law schools, which is critically important, but also to collaborate with professional organizations to expand civic education on the rule of law and racial equity. And third, I think that law schools can, and the universities they're part of, can convene dialogues across difference and help to encourage bipartisan collaborations that can play a bridging role. So I'll stop there with those kind of initial thoughts.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And Donald, turning to you as Chief Counsel and Vice President at a leading advocacy nonprofit in Washington.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you to ACS and to the other esteemed panelists. It's really a humbling experience to be a part of this panel. Before I start, I just want to pause and take a brief moment of silence for the folks who were killed, both during and as a result of the insurrection on January 6th. So I agree with what's been said previously, and I think what Professor Osofsky was referring to in part is what I view as sort of a larger crisis of citizenship in our country, and by that I mean what we owe to each other, what we owe to our system of government, and frankly, what we owe to ourselves. And I think what we have seen, certainly that reached a fever pitch on January 6th, was the degradation of our civic ties and the othering, not just of people with different views, but the mistreatment of people that we view as other, and that comes in the form of racism, misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, manifesting itself. Both. I mean, it's hard to create a more visceral image than a overwhelmingly white crowd storming the Capitol violently and carrying the Confederate flag into the Capitol building, which didn't happen even during the Civil War. And I think in terms of what groups like mine in civil society and what advocates can do, and I will undoubtedly say something that sounds incongruous here, but one, I think we need to continue to communicate the urgency of the moment. I guess the thing that I'm struggling with right now, frankly, is if now is not the moment for reform, it's very hard for me to envision an event that an escalation of the events of January 6th, even as we have seen a different manifestation of that effort to invalidate the votes of Black and brown folks in state legislatures across the country. We have seen, animal helmets or whatever that the shaman was wearing replaced with suits and ties in state capitals across the country. But I think we have to make sure that we are continuing to communicate the urgency of the moment, even as we all struggle with a global pandemic, even as folks struggle with kitchen table issues that are constantly front of mind. If we miss this moment, and I'm talking in the next 12 months, it's impossible to get it back. And I don't know what the next step is in terms of the escalation of what we saw a year ago today. But what I will say as someone in civil society is that we also need to take manageable bites, right? We're not going to solve a crisis of citizenship or systemic racism in a year, right? We have to identify tangible goals. The legislation that is moving through the Senate, whether it's POTA or ECA or obviously the VRA. I also think one of the ways that we got here was because our elected leaders also fell down on the job. And we've gotten to the point where instead of taking incremental and reasonable steps to bolster ethics in government, to address the corrupting influence of money in politics, to address misinformation and disinformation on social media, we have ignored that responsibility, failed to take opportunities to even implement reasonable reforms. And now we're at a point, it's like when you wake up on January 1st and you realize that you should have been dieting the entire year before that, and you start freaking out. I think that's what we are experiencing right now. And so we have to continue to communicate that urgency, but we also tactically have to identify the incremental steps that we need to take to rebuild brick by brick what we have lost, and build further into the future.
Thank you, Donald. Professor Koh, to come back to you, you've laid out some big threats of the past. What do you see as the big threat of the future, and also what we can do to strengthen democracy now?
I think where we crossed a real line on January 6th is in the introduction of violence as a means that many people accept as a legitimate way to try to achieve political change in the United States. This had not been, and violence and threat of violence and force and intimidation with arms is something that really drives out the rule of law. When I was a college student, Korea, my father's native country, was controlled by a military dictatorship. And he told me on the day that Nixon left office, the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship is in a place where you live under the rule of law, if you control the military, it's because you're the president. But that in a dictatorship, if you control the military, they call you president. And I think that's the greatest threat that we have. And I think as someone who's a law teacher, it's very important to me to emphasize that these are spaces, elections, political discourse, which can be done respectfully and vigorously, but not through threats and intimidation, use of force, vigilante violence, or the like. And you have a piece on this yourself today, Rachel, in the Atlantic, which I'd recommend all read.
Thank you very much. And I want to stay with you for just a minute, Professor Koh. As we examine this problem, one more aspect of it is international. Obviously, we've had plenty of homegrown racism and violence for many, many decades. But given your role as the State Department, you've also seen the international aspects. of these transnational movements. Can you speak at all to that aspect of the problem here at home?
Yeah, I think you did a fine job in our introduction of pointing out where things are going on a global trend. You know, there's a rise of global authoritarianism of which Trump was a part, but the new global authoritarians play by the same playbook. They demonize immigrants, they cow legislators, they disparage multilateral institutions, they attack bureaucrats, they intimidate the judiciary, they reward their cronies, they intimidate the media, and they claim that constitutional checks and balances should give way to the will of the people. They claim to be populists. And we see this all over the world. Obviously, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, but look in Hungary, the example of Viktor Orban, who's gerrymandered parliamentary districts, packed the courts, driven a major university, Central European University, out of his country. We see it in Latin America, Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, particularly the collapse of society in Venezuela because of Maduro's actions, all recalling what happened in Peru in the 90s. We see it in Chile, the struggle between now two very extreme views, an election in which the right-wing candidate Cast won the first round and then was finally defeated in the second round by the left-wing candidate Boris. Turkey, Erdogan has now become one of the world's leading authoritarians, jailing jurists and journalists and politicians. India, you mentioned, a place where Hindu nationalists are passing laws tilting elections and quelling protests and stifling speech. It's precisely because that this is a global trend that I think today in President Biden's very strong speech at the Capitol, he emphasized the need not just to build democracy here in the United States, but also abroad. And that's part of his initiative of the Summit for Democracy, which focuses on working with other countries to support the rule of law, to support human rights, and to address corruption, which is and the misuse of funds by governments, which is a main cause of how these oligarchs get into power. I think finally we should just acknowledge that there's an anti-globalist sentiment that's driven this authoritarianism. You know, the 90s unleashed economic forces and caused technological shifts that arguably killed jobs and froze wages, and people everywhere blamed the migration of manufacturing. The middle class felt abandoned. Inequality grew, so did middle class rage. Immigrants got targeted. And so the attack then turned on diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, a new focus on racism and xenophobia. And that's what's led to this common trend that we're seeing in many, many countries, not just in our country. And so the question is, how can democracies work together to deliver? Because if there's a lack of faith in democracy being able to deliver, then people will turn to authoritarian alternatives. And I think that's what the president was trying to emphasize at the end of his speech today.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. And it was quite a speech. If anyone here hasn't heard it, I suggest they go back. So let's turn now to what we can do to strengthen pillars of accountability. And I see, by the way, the Q&A, it's growing. I suggest it grow more. So please do send in your questions. We will get to them at the end, and I'll try to pull in some as we go. But I want to talk about the profession of law, the business community, national legislation, courts and state legislatures, and the nonprofit sector and international sector as different areas we can look at for leverage to make change. And then some of the questioners are interested in their individual roles, and we can get to that toward the end. Dina Saskia, I want to start with you. You took part in a letter with nearly 160 law school deans condemning January 6th and the role of lawyers in particular and perpetuating the big lie. Now, the letter didn't name names. I can. And obviously, there are certain individuals like John Eastman who seem to have taken strong anti-democratic stands. There's now a formal request to the state bar for an ethics investigation against him that the former chair of the State Bar's Committee on Professional Rules of Conduct wrote. How can the profession uphold norms so that it's clearly standing for democracy, not for partisan purposes, but upholding these norms of democracy? How can the profession police itself?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And, I think, the dean's letter really, there were a lot of deans who were speaking out individually on January 6th and on the days following, but I think we felt like this was such an important assault on democracy and the rule of law that we needed to say something collectively. And it really was a collective drafting effort among many deans. And there were two main pieces to what we were speaking to then. One was to the Capitol attack as an assault on democracy and the rule of law, but also to the concerns about lawyers bringing claims not grounded in facts and evidence, which is really what you're referencing in sort of these professional discipline actions. And honestly, this just goes back to the basics of professional responsibility that I started learning about in Professor Koh's civil procedure class as a first-year law student, right? This is really basic, which is that lawyers have a responsibility to bring claims supported by facts and evidence. And so I think part of the accountability is when professional discipline actions are brought against lawyers who don't bring claims based in fact and evidence. But I also think that some of the accountability actually came from judges and election officials across the political spectrum who upheld those values. And I think that's a really important thing to note in all of this, because as these cases were being brought where they weren't, and again, I think it's really important to reinforce that it is fine to bring lawsuits challenging problems with elections, right? That's an important part of our democratic process. But those lawsuits, lawyers have a professional responsibility to have a basis for their claims, right? And so what you saw was judges across the political spectrum, appointed by different presidents, including President Trump, rejecting these claims. And so I actually think there was something positive in our democratic process and an accountability function that our courts were playing in that moment that it's important to acknowledge. Similarly, there continue to be, just in the past week, election officials who are saying nothing bad, like this election was conducted properly, right? So I think there's a role for people to play in all of that as well. So in terms of what law schools and the legal profession can do, I think it's about really reinforcing when our students are in law school, when our students go to practice, and through discipline as needed, what our basic obligations of professional responsibility are, right? And so because the reason that lawsuits can be so important and effective in getting at problems is because of that professional responsibility, because we ground them in real substantive claims. And so I think that, in some ways it's just so basic, the professional responsibility piece of all of this.
Terrific. Donald, I want to go to you and talk about corporations, which right after January 6th, there was a move to hold corporations accountable. A number of them seemed to stop giving and then pretty quickly started giving again to some of the politicians that had financed lies. I know Crew is focused on that. Is there a strategy to really make corporations play a role in our democracy that helps them be a pillar of accountability and strength as well?
Well, certainly, and I think they have the business community has invited that responsibility, right? And we don't have to look to January 6th. We can look at the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and other Black Americans, and you saw a lot of folks in the business community sort of for the first time speak out against systemic racism in at the time a potentially meaningful way. I think what January 6th revealed and the donations to politicians both in Congress and in Secretary of State's offices subsequent to the insurrection have revealed that those commitments were pretty thin. But I think what we have seen is that the business community often likes to talk about corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship. But again, I think we as consumers, we as folks in the legal community, within the business community, need to push corporate America to really articulate and live up to what citizenship means in that context. My organization did a review of donations from corporations following the insurrection and found 717 corporations gave upwards of $18 million in donations to 140 members of Congress who voted to overturn the election on January 6th. A lot of these same companies, when the Georgia voter suppression law was passed, issued news statements, imploring elected officials to work together in a bipartisan fashion to support voting rights. Meanwhile, these same companies are making donations to the Paul Gosars of the world. We saw what happened in between the election and the insurrection was Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, and several other, I think a dozen secretaries of state across the country filed a bogus lawsuit to overturn the votes in 4 battleground states. And while the legal community, as Dean Osofsky mentioned, stood up and flatly rejected those claims, we saw 20 companies gave upwards of $600,000 in donations to those secretaries of states in the aftermath of the insurrection. And we have to continue to shine a light on these abuses, because I think oftentimes no one's paying attention, and these companies are banking on it. And from the perspective of someone who tracks closely money in politics, the irony here is the money's not that much, right? And so you really have to question what these companies were hoping to gain by throwing a couple of $1,000s at some politicians in exchange for their stated values of racial justice or support for voting rights. And I think that goes to the bigger question of the influence of money in our politics, but also it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think we have to continue to push for transparency, we have to promote transparency, because some of this information is available and we have to shine a light on it, and we have to amplify it, even as we push both in the courts and in our activism for more transparency legally and from these companies themselves.
Donald, we're getting more and more questions, so I want to jump to my next question for you. So in the interest of time, you've also worked on the Protect Our Democracy Act and the Electoral Count Act, Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Act, and so on. In terms of activities that you think could hold the government accountable, how much weight do you give to this kind of legislation versus these other levers of power that you're trying to move forward through CREW, the Hatch Act violation work that you do, the corporate accountability work that you do, and then this kind of legislative activity that you're doing?
So I think we've all experienced this, but it really, it has to be a kitchen sink approach. It has to be everything. And, we, at the beginning of the Trump presidency, my organization, dusted off the emoluments clauses of the Constitution, which a lot of folks hadn't heard about before, and sued under the emoluments clause to help hold President Trump accountable. I think the Hatch Act has gotten a lot more attention than it did before, and so I think we have to start with what we got and really push ourselves to use the tools in our toolkit. But I think we also I think the Voting Rights Act, it has to pass. It is essential to protecting folks' access to the polls. And again, we call January 6th an insurrection because there were armed rioters who stormed the Capitol. But we cannot forget that there are people in suits and ties who are essentially working every day to do what those rioters failed to do, which is overturn and undermine the votes of millions of Americans in Black and brown communities. And we have to push, we have to push Congress, we have to push the Senate to let go of the vestiges of discrimination and let go of the filibuster to push this legislation through. And I think it will have a transformational impact, but one piece of legislation alone is not going to be enough, right? I think there was the sort of smoke and mirrors about the Electoral Count Act earlier this week, pushed by or attributed to Leader McConnell. And I think this is a yes and type situation. And so we're gonna continue to push Congress to pass that legislation. It's critically important, but it's not enough. And I think, going back to my point about citizenship, I think we have to remind people that government and being a citizen is work, daily work, right? Work to educate ourselves, work to continue to push our elected leaders. None of these laws, none of these tools is a silver bullet. This requires daily engagement.
Thank you so much, Donald. I want to turn to Professor Coe for looking at the courts. Obviously, you're lawyers largely in this audience, and the courts are a key bastion of accountability, but also of upholding the Constitution in this last election. And they've served their purpose. They serve their purpose in many democracies in strengthening democracy before it fails. And yet there was this niggle in many of the rulings that the Supreme Court was putting out in which more power was moving towards state legislatures. And so I'd love for Professor Coe to both address the roles the courts are playing in upholding accountability, but also this potential issue and how that could play.
Yeah, so in this area, there's a little bit of good news and then a lot of bad news. The good news was, as we all saw, there was an amazing performance by state and local electoral officials in insisting on counting ballots fairly and certifying results. And then there's been an effort to get those people out, people like Brad Raffensperger. The Supreme Court, to its credit, did not overturn results in any states and turned aside frivolous lawsuits that were brought by Trump supporters in the period between the election and January 20th. But in future cases, you could probably expect there to be better lawyers making better arguments with more facts on their side. The bad news, which is what Donald Sherman has flagged, is that there's been an effort to do covertly what was done overtly at the Capitol, which is to try to normalize and legalize voter suppression by actions in lots of different state arenas. We're seeing examples of voter suppression, gerrymandering, barriers to voting by people who are poor and members of minority groups, districting abuses based on targeting exclusion of racial minorities. And the greatest danger has come from the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act. This started in the Shelby County case in 2013, when they said that pre-clearance was no longer necessary by the Department of Justice. And then it continued in the Abbott versus Perez case, where the court then upheld a bunch of Texas gerrymandering laws, which would have been struck under any fair notion of pre-clearance. And then most recently, last term in the Arizona cases, where there was a strong challenge brought to two laws about disenfranchisement of voters who had voted in the wrong precinct. Justice Alito introduced a new test, really made out of whole cloth, called mere inconvenience cannot be enough to demonstrate a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. In other words, it's up to the judges to determine what is a mere inconvenience as opposed to something which is a serious deprivation of the right to vote. And he also linked this really with no basis to the way things were in 1982 as a presumptively acceptable measuring rod of when voting restrictions could be fair. This has led to two big trends. One is almost non-existent judicial review. In a case called Purcell versus Gonzalez, the Supreme Court said that when a court rules near an election, it should not intervene in the results of the case, which means that if a legislature acts and the court will then not take the case or will not decide the issue. The second is near total deference to state legislatures and what they do. In one case, a concurring opinion by Justice Gorsuch set forth something he called the independent state legislature doctrine. I'll just read the quote. The Constitution provides that state legislatures, not federal judges, not state judges, not bear primary responsibility for setting election rules. And he said that with the support of three of the other justices. Now, when you consider that in 2022, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan will have contested elections for their governors, and that the Democratic governors have been the ones who have blocked or vetoed state legislative action that would strip or restrict people the right to vote, you see how threatening this is, that you could have a situation where state legislatures can decree that some board that answers to them intervene and essentially complete the vote tallies in counties that are clearly going in an opposite direction. So I think this is a cause of great concern. I think we have to be conscious of the fact that we have a Supreme Court where three of the justices were appointed by presidents who hadn't won a majority of the popular vote, where now we have the same justices being confirmed by senators who don't make up a majority of whose representatives don't make, constituents don't make up a majority of the population. And we have a real problem or concern about minority government being entrenched through manipulation of electoral rules and then upheld by courts, which are determined to give the key voice to state legislatures.
Thank you. That was a very thorough coverage of a very disturbing topic. My hope had been to cover strength, but obviously we needed to cover what's really going on. Dean Nosofsky, maybe you can bring us back to a little positivity, although I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. You've been active in supporting collaborative efforts among law schools and professional organizations. We've also gotten a slew of questions about whether it's still possible to conduct dialogue across division. Is there any way to bring people back who believe in misinformation or conspiracy? What can you do to kind of get this collaboration to strengthen democracy when there's so many people who seem to have given up altogether and stepped out of the building? And so I wonder if you can speak to what the nonprofit sector can do in the face of a pretty dire situation that Professor Koh just sketched.
Thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting on the fact that I'm supposed to be bringing positivity after, I mean, you know, I want to really acknowledge the very serious problems that we're talking about here and that are in the Q&A being discussed. But, you know, I think it's really important that we translate statements or listening into action, right? That we do everything we can to make an impact. And so, you know, as you mentioned, you know, this has been like one of the things that law deans have been doing and that professional organizations have been doing in the aftermath of the Capitol attack, and also as part of the racial justice reckoning, which of course, racism is a long-standing problem in this country. It is to really think about how do we work together to move the needle. And so some of that has been, convenings. I mean, the AALS, ABA, and LSAC convened a conference on rebuilding democracy and the rule of law. Some of that has been around publication. I just came from a really, incredible panel on Beyond Imagination, the January 6th Insurrection, which is a book project by 14 deans in response to what happened, thinking about how we make progress. But, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, a number of deans, we came together to think about, what if law schools all over the country tried to move the needle on police practices by making impact in individual jurisdictions in combination, so that something that's very state and local you could impact nationally. And from that has been born the ABA Legal Education Police Practices Consortium, which involves more than 40 law schools now. 5 deans are being honored tomorrow by SALT for the anti-racism clearinghouse project that they organized, and that it has really provided important resources for law schools that are trying to move forward anti-racism work. In the aftermath of January 6th, I started talking with other deans and with a number of professional organizations like the Federal Bar Association and the World Justice Project and Street Law and ACS about, how might we expand civic education on rule of law and racial equity? Because a part of this, it feels like there's a profound need for civic education somehow. One of the things though that's so important is, and we're working now to understand what's already occurring so that we don't reinvent wheels separately, right? There are a lot of efforts already taking place. And so I think it's really important that these collaborations look at how do you add value? I've been thinking a lot lately about whether we could do something really bold to bridge the access to justice gap, which speaks to the experience that so many people have of our legal system that disillusions them with it, right? I mean, when you have 86% of poor people unable to get legal counsel or having inadequate legal counsel, this is a huge problem that we have to get at. So I guess part of what I'm saying is that some of the examples I'm using aren't just around elections. And that's actually on purpose, because I think that part of what we need to do is think about ways we come together to build the fabric of our civil society to create those bridges. And I guess that's where I'm going to, I know we're limited on time, but I just want to speak to the second part of your question a little bit. Because I recognize that people feel very far apart in this country right now. People have stopped talking to one another in really profound ways. And I don't want to be naive as somebody who, fundamentally, my idea is that we can talk across political difference comes from having grown up in Kansas when we had a Democratic governor and 2 Republican senators, and they actually worked together. And I recognize we're far away from my childhood in Kansas, but I think that there are ways in which we in our institutions can create, conversation. So, for example, when in my prior deanship, on the day that Trump was impeached, we had a joint Federalist Society ACS event in which we had people from different parts of the political spectrum giving analysis about the impeachment, right? So part of it is that if we can still create, and I think we can, conversations in which we bring people together who disagree with each other, that can be really important. But I also think that sometimes we can create progress by reframing things, right? So one of the things that I've looked at in my work on energy partisanship, for example, and I work on climate change, which occasionally gets polarized too, is an information sharing model, which is what we often try to use, is actually very ineffective, right? So what you have to figure out is what people value and who they listen to, and see if you can find some common ground, and sometimes ask the question differently, right? So for example, we did a convening at Penn State around methane emissions of unconventional oil and gas, which was one of the most contentious energy issues in Pennsylvania at the time. But we brought together people from industry and both parties and NGOs and asked the question, if you took the latest science coming out of Penn State and elsewhere, could you actually come up with something that's better for the environment and better for industry? So I think that, and I'm giving you a lot of examples outside of the election context to say that part of how we start to bridge difference, I think, is about respecting people's expressive rights, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more later, but also but also about finding ways that we can have conversations in the places that we might still agree and build from there. And it feels very small right now, and I see that in the comments, and I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I think the only path forward is to try to do some bridging.
Thank you. And yes, I do want to come back to this issue because it does seem to be a major topic of the comments and also a major focus for our society. But Donald, another topic in some of the questions is, can we use RICO against Donald Trump? What about Hatch Act violations? People are trying to come up with, what things are justiciable here. I'm a student of Isaiah Berlin, where all good things do not go together. And I worry a little bit about good intentions and even good accountability creating backlash. And I want to lay out my worry, and then I would love for you to put it to bed or to just discuss it, which is basically that in other countries, when we see one side of government going against the other side, it tends to lead to a cycle, whether or not the reasons are good. And also when corruption changes happen, we also see that enough corruption charges tend to abet populist authoritarians, that people sort of throw up their hands and say, the whole system's broken, everyone's corrupt, all politicians are crooked, and they bring in outsiders, whether it's Silvio Berlusconi in Italy or Bolsonaro in Brazil or what have you. And so how can a watchdog organization like yours do its job, bring these kinds of lawsuits and accountability, and yet bolster trust in the system rather than feed this sort of pernicious distrust?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and it's a unique one that I've felt since I started in the ethics space on the ethics committee, right? The overwhelming majority of people go into government with the best intentions. I know Professor Coe previously served. I just recently left the White House. I have great reverence for public service, and it is incredibly important. And we saw this in the 2016 cycle when folks sort of dismissed concerns about then candidate Trump mixing his business with the functions of the government, because, oh, well, all politicians do this, or all politicians are corrupt. Maybe he's just a little bit better at it, or a little bit richer, and so people are up in arms. And I think one of the things that we have to do is, in our work, continue, whenever we have an opportunity to do so, continue to elevate service, right? Service to others. And which is essentially what government service is. And frankly, take steps to bolster the civil service, which obviously came under great pressure and attack in the last administration. And that means, taking steps to protect civil servants, protect whistleblowers, support the inspector general community. All of those things are sort of affirmative policy directives that aren't super attractive, don't get a lot of attention often, but are ways that folks in civil society can continue to frame the conversation around government service as a good, and the work in elevating the practice of government service writ large. It's always bad news that gets the most attention, but even in those stories where we can, I think we have to elevate the positive. I got a press inquiry a couple of weeks ago about a member of Congress who I had worked with on the ethics committee, and it was about members buying and selling stock. And even as I was expressing concern about the conduct, I had to make the point that this member was a champion for ethics. And one of the reasons why we want members not to buy and trade individual stocks is because it undermines that great good work that this member was doing, or leads to questions that could undermine that work. And so I think, accentuate the positive sounds, difficult, and it is at times, especially when we're in crisis. But I think we have to take opportunities to do that, and also protect the institution of civil service, and draw comparisons to where people see government service in a positive light, right? That may be law enforcement, that may be the Postal Service, though maybe not right now, and drawing those connections, though, I think helps sort of bridge the divide between, everybody that works in government is corrupt and out, and out to line their pockets, and the need to sort of promote civil service as a good, and promote service and citizenship as a good.
That's terrific. And I think post-Christmas, you're even safe praising the Postal Service despite the politicization. So similarly on backlash, we have a whole series of questions about, is this backlash based on fear? Is it based on demographic anxiety, a desire to keep status? There's all sorts of studies about the racial status issue and the demographic change issue that we can speak to, and I'm happy to share that social science. But one thing that I've been particularly worried about is the trajectory of radicalization we see overseas, and whether we might be seeing it replicating here. One thing we know overseas, when you look at radicalization in extremist populations, is that lack of voice, lack of democracy, lack of voice tends to lead people to seek their own communities and then to radicalize within their own communities. And in America, there's been a study that's been carried out since 1954 on self-censorship. And it's grown threefold. Self-censorship has grown threefold along polarization in the general population. And then there's been similar studies within the university community that people are self-censoring, and particularly conservatives are self-censoring. My worry is that what we might be seeing is people, whether it's racial anxiety, demographic anxiety, status, what have you, people might be self-censoring, and in that moving into online communities where they feel more comfortable expressing their views and so on. And those communities are more radical than it would be if they were bringing their commentary into the general discussion and becoming more and more radical, and that might be part of what we're seeing. And I think the discussions across difference, while extremely laudable, don't necessarily get at this kind of social pressure, the sort of thing that we see in, say, the University of North Carolina study that says most of the students are worried about other students. The professors are actually very inclusive. And they're not wrong to be worried about other students, because 20% of the liberal students say it would be just fine to obstruct other students from hearing views they don't like, and actually using some level of activity to obstruct those views. So what can we do to keep people from feeling that they have to move into their own separate communities, and as they're moving into their own communities, possibly deepening this extremism and polarization that might be leading to some of this radicalization we're seeing? And I'll bring that maybe first to Dina Sofsky and then to Professor Coe.
Thanks. Thanks for that important question. And I don't think there's an easy answer to this. It's not like I can, in the 3 minutes or less I'm supposed to speak on this, solve this problem, right? You're right. It's a big problem. But I think the way we work through it in our university communities is we create kind of open lines of communication and dialogue, and we make it clear that we can have commitments to expressive rights and at the same time commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we had a situation at Northwestern this fall where a speaker, a conservative speaker came in who had tweets that a lot of people in our community found offensive. And our other students organized a big protest. And so, what we worked with the students bringing the speaker, the students who were organizing the protest, our student government, And, you know, we're able to have 2 floors of one of our buildings full of protesters in a really well done protest that didn't disrupt the speaker. That doesn't speak to self-censorship per se, but I think that, you know, a lot of times we highlight times where, you know, these issues run into difficulties at universities, and we all can list lots of examples of that. They're all over the news. But I think that, you know, we also have to keep trying to bring people together, to allow for people to have outlets to express themselves and disagree with one another. And you know, and also, and I'm a big believer in iterative responsiveness. So we're not always going to get it right, but it's about being able to non-defensively acknowledge it and continue to work with the people in our community to try to get it more right, right? So maybe, you know, one group of students doesn't feel supportive enough in all of this, right? Well, but if you're talking to them, if you're in communication, that really makes a difference. And so, I mean, I think that part of the answer in all of this is that we have to find ways to keep communicating with each other, right? That part of the breakdown in all of this is when we stop talking. I also think, you know, a lot of my broader experience in thinking about these issues is informed by the work I did many years ago, fighting David Duke in Louisiana with the Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, and realizing that while some of the voters really were motivated by racist sentiments, there were also a lot of people who felt very left behind. And I think you see that on both the radicalization of the right and the left right now, right? So how we find a way to make people feel heard and to allow people to express themselves, and yet also be able to express kind of that we have values, that there you know, that there are things we believe in, and that we may deeply disagree with the things that people are expressing, right? I just think there's not an easy answer to all of this in a polarized society, but we certainly aren't going to get better if we throw up our hands and give up, right? What we have to find ways to talk to each other, and to create spaces, whether it's in our universities or a broader society, where we facilitate that kind of communication.
Thank you. And Professor Koh, do you want to speak to this problem of self-censorship and possible radicalization?
So this is going to sound very simplistic, but I think one thing we can do is defeat COVID or get it under control. You know, Harry said people feel far apart. They are far apart. You know, COVID has been going on since the last year of the Trump presidency, and it is literally the case that people do not engage across their Zoom boxes. Their sense of community in every single work unit, academic unit is frayed. There are very few occasions for, you know, you don't put a group of freshmen together in a room of different views so they get a chance to talk things out. You don't have the kinds of conversations among people from different backgrounds where they try to find common ground on issues like, you know, when should the rule of law prevail, you know, when is it appropriate to restrain racist speech on campus, this kind of question. And it seems to me that, you know, if we can dampen or normalize, or in some other way get back into a situation where we have something more closely resembling normal communities, a lot of this kind of social capital can be regained. And a lot of the kinds of conversation that we just dropped out of, you know, if you're in your bubble, I don't know if you're self-censoring so much as you're just reaching out to people who are going to, you know, say, I agree, or demonize others who you don't like, or flame people, and you have tweet for tweet combat as opposed to actual genuine dialogue. And then, you know, then when people venture out to go to a rally, there's a fight, or if they venture out to go to the polls, there are other people there who have been brought there by tweet or email taunting them, or you know, expressing hatred toward what they believe. So I do think that this loss of social fabric that we've experienced over the last 2 years now really should not be minimized for the role that it's played. Obviously we've done a great job trying to keep things going through various kinds of Zoom conversations, but I don't really have a good sense of how many people on this call disagree with what I say, or whether I'm going to be able to ever speak to them about it. And we haven't had an American Association of Law Schools or SALT meeting in person for 2 or 3 years now. So all of these are destructive of the normal forms of discourse that we have for bridging differences.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, and I want to do one more question to the panel that brings in a number of other questions that showed up in the Q&A, which is really what individuals can do. What can one person do? What can one non-litigator do? What is an organization that you would recommend that's doing something to strengthen democracy? So now moving away from the kind of big picture, big scale things and moving back toward more individual action. And Donald, if we can start with you and then move to Dina Sofsky and then back to you, Professor Coe. One person, one non-litigator, those can be the same or different, and one organization you would recommend that's doing good work to strengthen democracy.
One non-litigator. I think certainly Benny Thompson, who's the chair of the House Homeland.
Sorry, I should have been more. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Nobody
I should have been more
government?
clear. No, not what can one person do? What could an individual member of the audience do if they wanted to create change?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I think one person can engage, right? And that may mean educating themselves on an issue that goes beyond reading tweets, reading Facebook posts. It could be reaching out to their neighbor who they haven't seen in a while because of COVID or something else, and starting a conversation. But I think building back, it could be donating to an organization or volunteering, but figuring out one way that you feel comfortable with to engage, and again, to build back those civic ties. Like, obviously you can call your senators and do all of those things, but I think starting small is important. One organization, or one thing that an organization can do.
What's one organization to support? So this is, what can the individuals in the audience do?
Yeah, so obviously I work for an organization. It's Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. I'm not going to plug my own organization beyond that, but I think the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund sort of sits at the intersection of the fight for racial justice, the fight for democracy reform, the fight against extremism, that is sort of central to all of these issues. They are the ones that secured the victory in Brown versus Board of Education. They are as tried and true as there can be in the civil rights community, and I can't say enough good things about them.
Thank you. Dina Sofsky, what can a member of the audience do, and what's an organization that you would recommend?
So I'll be very fast with 3 things. So one is get involved with supporting the right to vote, right? And you can do this in a completely nonpartisan way, or if you choose a partisan way, right? But I think that helping ensure that people understand how voting works in wherever they're voting, and help them get to the polls and help support those rights. Those are very sort of concrete things you can do. A second very concrete thing people can do is get involved in civic education. To the extent that we can help ensure that this, next generation is getting exposed to, important ideas about law and democracy. And you don't have to be a litigator to go into schools and participate in that. And there are a lot of great organizations doing that work. And then, I think a third thing is to, make an effort to talk to people and to really start to bridge some of these divides. And as I want to sort of end where I began, which is that I think, to the extent that a big piece of this puzzle is about inequity and racism, I think there are all sorts of ways in which we can engage in anti-racist work and in work that increases equity in our society that are important as well. I don't know. I was trying to figure out it since I haven't taken off my dean hat about endorsing any one organization. But I think that what I will say is that there are a lot of different organizations, and we provided resource guides that are doing the kind of work that I described, and a lot of resource guides that list a bunch of these organizations. And I would encourage people to find an organization that you're comfortable with, as Donald said, and really make a commitment to spend an hour a week, 2 hours a week, whatever it is you have time to do to do this work.
Thank you. And Professor Coe, you get the last word.
Well, on elections, I'd support Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams' organization, which I think has done an extraordinary job. As an international democracy person, I support the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, which are two institutes set up by political parties to promote democracies overseas universities. I'd urge everybody to read Ron Daniels and Phil Spector's new book, How Universities Can Help Democracy. They point out that the ways in which universities facilitate democracy is obviously through promoting diversity and social mobility, but also through education and citizenship and in teaching people commitment to the truth and commitment to facts. And that's something all of us can do in all of us who are academics. This is going back to what Harry said about our ethical responsibilities to make our case based on facts and to understand the difference between the rule of law and the rule of power.
So on that note of the rule of law and rule of power, I have to answer one question myself. One of the questioners asked if violence was going to eventually be necessary to uphold democracy against those who would see it destroyed. And as someone who specializes in political violence, I just have to say that I don't think that would be a good idea. This is not a radical position to be taking, I realize, but I just want to put some flesh on those bones. Not only is it not a good idea because we generally support the rule of law, but it's not a good idea if you actually want to win democracy, because the most likely path for authoritarianism right now, I think, is through backlash by goading liberals into violent action, and then using that violent action as a guise and excuse for more authoritarian policing methods, and then more crackdowns. We see that overseas many, many times. And I believe that we are going to see that here as well. Professor Coe suggested my article, so I'll put it here, and I'll put a couple of other articles on political violence here as well for those interested. This has been an amazing conversation. We're 4 minutes over time, so I'm going to close. I really am incredibly grateful to our panelists, to ACS, and to SALT for giving us all this opportunity. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for spending your evening with us on a important but difficult topic. If you're interested in learning more about the state of democracy, please come listen to ACS's Broken Law podcast. And we hope to see you all at future ACS events and SALT events. Thank you so much. Take care.